Hi, I'm Ben April, CTO of Farsight.
And I'm Paul Vixie, CEO and founder at Farsight.
Welcome to this week's episode of Reflect and Amplify. Today we're going to walk through a series of frequently asked questions about passive DNS as it relates to privacy. DNS can be a complicated topic, so we're going to cover what we can today, and we'll come back for more in future episodes.
Yeah, and we want this to be as interactive as possible and as relevant as possible. So we will hope to hear from you. We need to hear from you as to what you'd like to see covered or maybe recovered in greater depth. And there's an email address, reflectamplify@farsightsecurity.com, which we encourage you to use. And if you are joining us live, there is a chat room in YouTube, and we encourage you to put your questions there, and our moderator will see that we address them. One small note, the first triple espresso did nothing. This one may lead to behavior change, which you will witness. Live with it.
All right, so as we've said, we've assembled a list of questions that we get asked commonly out in the field, working with sensor partners and customers about how privacy works as related to passive DNS. So, Paul, hit me with the first shot.
All right. So, Ben, who are the parties? There are various types of person who runs DNS somehow. And what kind of privacy can each of those parties really reasonably expect?
Okay, good one. So we start at the top of the stack with what we call the authority servers. This is where content enters the DNS. If you're thinking about the DNS as the phone book of the internet, it's the collection of phone numbers. It's the source of that data. As such, it is published information. Unlike a phone book, it shouldn't be PII. It shouldn't be names, phone numbers, addresses, anything, worthy of privacy protections. Ideally, what you find in a published zone is the information necessary to reach a website or internet-based service. Unfortunately, we do occasionally find PII published in a DNS zone, but it is, it's definitely something we discourage. There are multiple ways that information becomes available, either through user queries, through observing user queries, and a number of other techniques that allow both good guys and bad guys to monitor what's happening in the DNS. So the idea that something you publish in a zone is in any way private or secret is an idea you shouldn't hold on to too tightly.
Well, so just in case somebody is arriving at this new, PII means personally identifiable information. And it's a particular type of thing that is regulated in some places, but is always somewhat dangerous. But Ben, it sounds like everything in a zone is public information, and you shouldn't put anything there that you don't want the public to know, even down to the level of maybe putting an API key into the DNS on the basis that maybe only the person who knows part of the key could get to the rest of it. You don't think that's safe?
No, I don't. We see it more often than any of us would like to. The use of the DNS as a database, somehow, imagined to be protected by an API key. But when you really think about the whole ecosystem, you've got things like passive DNS, you've got deep packet inspection and firewalls, you've got endpoint security services, and you've got the ability to brute force with really, no protections. There's no authorization in the DNS. So, making use of hidden or obscured values as a way to secure access to something is only going to last as long as you're lucky.
What about the stub users?
Yeah, so moving on from the authority, we've got the stub. This is what we call the resolver that lives in your phone or your laptop or your internet-enabled refrigerator, whatever's making queries on your behalf. This is where the privacy-related information really enters the system. This is where you've got the combination of user identity, usually in the form of an IP address associated with your device, connected with the query stream you are producing. Some of those queries are eminently harmless. Others provide information about the types of resources and information you're reaching out to, and might become a privacy concern. So really, the main recommendation I have there is have a recursive resolver, which is the next step in this process, that you trust. This is going to act as a broker. It's going to support a large number of users, ideally, and make queries on their behalf and cache the answers, which means anyone watching the recursive server seeking information from authority servers will only be observing the pieces, how to find the .com name servers, how to find the example.com name servers, but that is stripped of any personal information. There's no connection back to the stub resolver. There's no way to know what user asked this question, only that this question was asked by some user of this particular recursive. You really want to have that. You should have a relationship with your recursive resolver, ideally contractual, where you understand what they're allowed to do with the information they can see from you. Every ISP offers this service. You've got a number of cloud providers that will do it for free. And for anyone reasonably technical, this is not hard by any stretch. They can run their own recursive resolver and proxy those queries so that the stub to recursive traffic is not visible to the outside world.
So can the recursive server do anything to protect sort of their privacy or the privacy of their client population?
It's important for a recursive resolver to think about that in terms of things like log retention and policy around what they do with that data and how they handle that data. There's definitely a responsibility for those folks to make sure that they are handling that information correctly. As long as they're configured correctly, the queries that go off to the authority servers are relatively free of really any concern. Ideally, they'll have queue name minimization turned on, which will segment the specific queries in such a way that when you're asking the root servers where to find .com, you're not necessarily asking the entire question. You're just asking the piece that server is responsible for. It avoids leaking additional information.
Well, that sounds like a little bit of inside baseball. But at a high level, I think I heard you say that if you're operating a recursive server, either on your laptop, as I do, or for your family, your company, or if you're an ISP doing it for your customers, or a corporation doing it for your employees, the larger your population is, the more kind of privacy you're going to get, because anyone who can observe the upstream queries, which, as you say, don't have any direct personal identifiable information, will mix in a lot of different people, a lot of different agents, and therefore it'll be hard to sort of de-anonymize that upstream. And so from the point of view of the worries, you seem to be saying that a recursive operator ought to be, you mentioned query minimization, but they ought to have the expectation that there isn't much privacy upstream, because you don't know if the authority servers you talk to are going to log those transactions. And, eventually they will figure out what part of the world's DNS client population is coming through that particular recursive. So the expectation of privacy, in your view, seems to be low for a recursive server operator.
In terms of the operator themselves, yeah. In general, there's not much on the line for the recursive operator as an entity. They're not entering any personal information. There's no PII from them other than maybe the IP addresses of the server. Really, what they're there to do is defend the population. Now, if as you run one on your laptop, you're generally supporting a population of one. That's not necessarily obvious to someone observing your traffic, but to an established data scientist, there might be some interesting noise in that their signal.
Yeah. Earlier you mentioned the ideal state of affairs being that you have some kind of a contract with the recursive server operator that you're using, such as use the one you're running yourself, use one from your ISP, because at least then you know what privacy law they are governed by. And maybe there's even a term in the contract that says that they won't use your data in ways that you don't have permission. But it occurs to me that it's very seductive to accept free gifts on the internet. If somebody says, I've got, some DNS server, x.x.x.x, I'm going to spray paint that on the side of the building during an Arab Spring event. If you use that server, then, you somehow are going to be safer. Does that actually make you safer, or are you just moving the risk?
In general, I think you're just moving the risk around. I mean, you may avoid a monitoring point at the local ISP, for example, the default resolver for the network you're on. But depending on what they're monitoring, we could have a whole episode on DOH and DOT, so I won't go deep there. But even if you're encrypting your DNS traffic, you still have to worry about the next packet. Once you've resolved, www. unsafeinthiscountrywebsite.com, you still have to make a connection with that website to do anything useful with it. So, the idea that privacy in the DNS is the only thing you have to worry about, presents a risk in itself.
Yeah, I've often said that DNS over HTTPS will probably not keep a dissident out of prison if they're hoping to avoid detection by the authoritative government that they're hoping to overthrow. Listen, we got to move on, but I did want to make a final comment on this thread having to do with a DNS Client Subnet. And this is something that was added to the DNS by pretty much the content delivery network operators of the world, because they like to use our DNS transactions as a way to tell us, there's a copy of the content close to you, here's the address. But in order to decide that address, they need to know where we're coming from. And as you've pointed out, that information is not available between the recursive and the authority. And the content delivery networks are the authority in this case. So this thing, eDNS Client Subnet, was added as a way to kind of leak that information above the recursive so that a content delivery network would know, oh, okay, so they're in North America, let me give them that server. Oh, they're in Europe, let me give them that server, that kind of thing. But it turns out to be a privacy disaster because of de-anonymization. Right? Data science is advancing much faster than privacy controls. And so we are losing this arms race. And if you leak this information, it becomes child's play to figure out who the end user was. This is such a bad idea that when Cloudflare created their 1.1 service, they decided not to support eDNS Client Subnet. And so I guess my advice is find out if the recursive server operator you intend to use is using eDNS Client Subnet. And if they are, don't use it. Anyway, we do have to move on. Let's talk about tracking pixels. So what are the privacy risks, beyond whether they know your IP address? What are the privacy risks in the DNS flow itself in terms of websites who really want to know who the end user is, and they know they can't get that data from the IP address or the DNS transaction? What do they do?
So what we'll often see, as you mentioned, tracking pixels. So the 1 pixel by 1 pixel image. Initially, these just had a unique name. The image file itself had a long, unique string that was associated in some database with the user that name was given to. So their browser would load that image, even though it didn't change the display any. And looking at the web logs, the tracker operator could figure out, who did what. I gave them this token. They looked it up from here. I've made a connection. Over time, that's evolved, and now we're including, in addition to the name, the host name that they're using to get to this image is also unique. So that they can capture some additional information about your DNS resolution path and things like that. In the ideal world, they are using opaque tokens for these unique values. They mean nothing. They are literally just a random value that is only relevant if you're holding the database that they were initially stored in. When you look into passive DNS, you're going to see some of these unique token host names. And in the cases where they are opaque, without that database, there's no impact. In passive DNS, you don't see the source IP because, we're monitoring traffic above the recursive resolver. You don't see the URL they were going to. You don't see the image name, any of those other elements. That's all good. If you have the database, chances are you've actually already seen that DNS lookup because you're running resolvers looking for those queries. So, passive DNS, deep packet inspection is not going to tell you anything you didn't already really know. The risk, as I see it, is when the values aren't opaque, when they mean something. There's been some value encoded into this token through some clever manipulation. I've seen it as dumb as base 64 all the way up to encryption. When you encode something privacy sensitive in that token and use it, it's fine until somebody figures out what the coding scheme is. And then once that coding scheme is broken, that information becomes available to a new audience. And that's getting pretty risky.
So in this case, the threat surface is the authority operator and anybody who can witness the traffic between the recursive and that authority operator,
Yep.
and also anybody who has access to passive DNS. Because in each of those cases, you may be able to use these opaque values to help de-anonymize somebody. This is like one of many clues that sort of goes into the equation. And yes, I have seen IP addresses, usernames, and passwords collated and then put into base 64 so that question helps identify the user who's asking it. And this is madness, but every week we seem to see another breach where there is a database of either unsalted passwords or unencrypted passwords or whatever. So I think as the internet keeps getting bigger, new people have to come learn old lessons the hard way at our expense. Anyway, I think we should move on.
That's good. All right. So, Paul, we've all heard of GDPR, CCPA, and other privacy regulations. How does that play into what we do with passive DNS and how we work?
Well, it was a shocking change to us and to our user community because Europe really does kind of have a government that is for the people, and they are willing to make sort of laws that are inconvenient for their big companies. And this is one of those. General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, was the second thing they did. The first was the right to be forgotten. Then they did GDPR, and this year they've added something called e-privacy, which extends this even further. And the California Act you mentioned, CCPA, is a rough copy of the same idea. And the idea is, if you're using the internet and people are watching you use the internet, you should have a say in how your personally identifiable information is used. And in fact, you have to give consent under the GDPR. You have to give consent for each separate use. So if you've given permission to, let's say, have your identity through web cookies or something used for performance reasons to just help the website deliver content to you faster, but you did not give them permission to sort of use this to help figure out, I don't know, what grocery store you're in so that they can start showing you ads for things that store is showing, there's quite a hefty fine that you can end up paying if you don't have permission, consent, case-by-case consent by these users. And I think this is good law. I think we've seen not just a massive loss of safety in the internet era, but also a massive loss of autonomy, which would come from unpredictability, which would come from some kind of privacy. And data science has really shown that almost anything you do can be used against you, or at least used in ways that the interests of the person using it don't have to be aligned with the interests of the person whose data it is.
Yep.
So what we did is to sort of create a European company with two partners. So there's a basically non-for-profit company headquartered in Karlsruhe under German law, which is actually much more strict than GDPR. So all of our European data sensor operators have the freedom of sending their data to a company that they know is under the same regulatory regime that they are. In other words, they're sort of outshipping the risk. If there's a problem with how the data ultimately gets used, it'll be because that company in Karlsruhe misbehaves, and then the German government gets involved, and bad things happen to the people who've misbehaved. That's been working, right? We've moved a lot of our sensor operators to Europe effectively, and that company has been able to figure out a safe way to anonymize this data in a way that's difficult to recover from. It's making Europe safer to be observed in this way, but in total respect for the European data subjects and their autonomy and their privacy.
All right. Are there any other regions that have similar regimes that we're tracking?
Sure. GDPR is actually a copy of German privacy law, sort of the way the euro is a copy of the Deutsche Mark. But they only did the easy parts. So GDPR is weaker than German national law. Canada is very serious about this, and their national privacy law is as strict as GDPR. Japan, likewise. China, likewise. Russia, likewise. And I think there's starting to be a sense that unless we want to move to a post-national history, where national governments are no longer in charge of who gets to do what to whom, and it's pretty much corporations doing whatever they want, that data is where the controls have to be instantiated, right? Physical borders don't mean so much. So these countries have recognized that we're in the information age, and that information superiority is what everybody is questing for, and that they have to be in the loop as to who has information superiority over whom. So I'm really hoping to see the California law replicated in other states. I'd like to ultimately see this as a federal law, something similar to the CCPA, because something has to be done. The people represented by the governments that they vote for or that they live under deserve a seat at the table.
I would agree. I agree.
So is it time for Q&A? Do we have any Qs?
Nope. Okay.
No questions. Well, okay then. I think it's time to get back to work. Thank you all for joining us today.
Tune in next week. We'll chat about the growing problem of large-scale cloud outages.
And remember, we'd love to hear your ideas for future episodes. We don't want to just sort of talk about what we care about. We are relevance junkies here. So remember, send those suggestions and questions to reflectamplify@farsightsecurity.com. And there are also a thread inside the Farsight Labs forum, which you can reach at labs.fsi.io. And yes, we will verify your email address before we let you in because spammers would otherwise scrape it, but we will not spam you. So don't worry about that. This is one time you can give your email address to somebody and not worry about the inbox impact.
All right. May your expectations be reasonable. We're out. I agree.